Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The story of Christianity, as it has been handed down for nearly 2 millennia, often begins in Rome or Jerusalem and is narrated through the lens of European scholars who shaped the modern image of Jesus, the apostles, and the early church. Yet beneath the surface of this narrative lie fragments of a more complex and richer history, one that ties the roots of Christianity to Black Hebrew traditions in African lands. Ancient scrolls, oral traditions, and archaeological findings have quietly revealed a past that challenges the Eurocentric retelling of Christianity's origins. It is a past that reconnects the faith not only to the soil of the Middle East but to Africa itself, and to the Hebrew communities who lived, thrived, and passed on their spiritual wisdom across generations. To step into this forgotten history is to reimagine the birth of Christianity through the eyes of the marginalized, the displaced, and the communities whose stories were overshadowed by imperial retellings. The Black Hebrew roots of Christianity are not simply a romantic or symbolic claim. They are anchored in historical evidence preserved in scrolls, inscriptions, and oral traditions that predate European interpretations. To understand this fully, one must go back to the ancient Hebrew communities that straddle both the Levant and Africa, whose presence and contributions are far more central to Christianity's foundations than has been commonly taught. The Hebrew identity itself was never confined strictly to the lands we now call Israel and Palestine. Ancient records, including Egyptian papyri and biblical texts themselves, show the Hebrews as a people with strong ties to Africa. Abraham, the patriarch of the Hebrews, journeyed into Egypt during famine. Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, rose to power in Egypt as Pharaoh's vizier. Moses was raised in the royal Egyptian court, and the Exodus story unfolds not in European imagination but against the backdrop of African soil. Even in later centuries, Hebrews maintained strong settlements in regions such as Nubia, Kush, and Ethiopia, where scrolls and inscriptions suggest the blending of African and Hebrew cultures. It is here, in Africa, that the earliest signs of a Hebrew-Christian connection take root. Ancient Ethiopian scrolls, some preserved in the Orthodox Tewahedo Church, record stories of Israelite migration into Africa. The Kabra Nagast, a 14th-century Ethiopian text drawing upon older traditions, tells of the union between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, linking the Davidic line with Ethiopian royalty. While later theologians dismissed such accounts as symbolic myth, recent scholarship and archaeological studies have shown that Israelite communities indeed migrated into Africa, forming settlements that carried Hebrew customs, languages, and scrolls with them. These communities became the seabed for what would later influence the earliest forms of Christianity. When Christianity emerged in the 1st century CE, it was not an invention of Rome but a development within Judaism itself. Jesus of Nazareth was a Hebrew, born into a family that kept the Torah, observed Hebrew festivals, and traced their lineage to David. His apostles were Hebrews, preaching not a new religion but the fulfillment of Hebrew prophecy. The very first followers of Jesus, known as the Nazarenes or Ebionites, continued to observe Hebrew customs such as Sabbath keeping, circumcision, and dietary laws. Ancient scrolls discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran shed light on Hebrew sects that awaited a messianic figure remarkably similar to Jesus, revealing the deeply Hebrew roots of his movement. What is often overlooked is how African Hebrews shaped this narrative. The Book of Acts records the baptism of an Ethiopian official, sometimes called the Ethiopian eunuch, by Philip the Apostle. This event, occurring within the first decades after Jesus' death, suggests that Christianity spread to Africa not through Roman missionaries centuries later, but through direct Hebrew-African connections from the very beginning. Ethiopian scrolls and liturgies still preserve some of the earliest Christian practices, including the use of the Guizi language for scripture, which some scholars believe retains Hebrew influences. One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence lies in the ancient scroll traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Unlike the Roman Catholic canon, which shaped much of Western Christianity, the Ethiopian canon of the Bible includes books like Enoch and Jubilees, texts deeply tied to ancient Hebrew spirituality. The Book of Enoch, long excluded by European churches, describes visions of angels, prophecies, and a cosmic Messiah figure. This book, preserved in Guizi scrolls, provides insight into the kind of Hebrew religious thought that formed the backdrop of Christianity. The fact that Ethiopia maintained these scrolls while Europe suppressed them suggests that Africa carried a more authentic memory of the Hebrew-Christian connection. Furthermore, inscriptions and manuscripts from Egypt and Nubia point to early Hebrew Christian communities. The Nag Hammadi scrolls, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained writings of early Christian sects that retained strong Hebrew elements, such as mystical interpretations of Genesis. The Coptic tradition, which took root in Egypt, also preserved Jewish Christian connections through liturgy and practice. Many of these communities were dark-skinned African Hebrews whose role in shaping Christianity has been overlooked in favor of narratives centered on Greece and Rome. The suppression of this African Hebrew identity was not accidental. As Christianity spread into the Roman Empire, it gradually detached from its Hebrew roots. Paul's reinterpretations of the gospel, often emphasizing faith over Hebrew law, created tensions with those who sought to preserve the original Hebrew identity of Jesus and his followers. By the time Christianity became the state religion under Constantine in the 4th century, the faith had been rebranded as a Greco-Roman institution. Scrolls that tied Christianity to Africa or emphasized Hebrew traditions were either excluded from the canon or labeled heretical. The Ethiopian and African traditions that preserved these texts were sidelined, their voices muted in the grand narrative of Christian history. Yet, history has a way of resurfacing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi codices, and the Ethiopian manuscripts that have come to light in modern times offer glimpses into the past that Rome tried to suppress. They reveal a Christianity that was once deeply Hebrew, Afro-Asiatic in identity, and rooted in African soil as much as in Palestine. They reveal that the earliest Christians were not blonde-haired or blue-eyed Europeans, but Hebrews and Africans whose skin reflected the sun-baked lands of the Near East and the Nile Valley. Even modern genetics and anthropology have lent weight to these findings. Studies of Jewish communities in Ethiopia, such as the Beta Israel, show deep connections to ancient Israelite lineages. Oral traditions among the Lemba people of southern Africa claim descent from Hebrew priests, and DNA evidence supports ties to ancient Israelite populations. These communities practiced Hebrew customs, preserved scroll traditions, and contributed to the early spread of Christianity across the continent. In many ways, the rediscovery of these scrolls and traditions is more than historical correction. It is a reclamation of identity. It challenges centuries of Eurocentric portrayals that disconnected Christianity from its Black Hebrew roots. It forces us to reconsider what Christianity looked like in its infancy, when it was still a Hebrew movement intertwined with African communities. It calls into question the images that dominate churches today of a pale Jesus and European apostles, and replaces them with a historically grounded reality of Hebrew and African founders. The Black Hebrew roots of Christianity also restore Africa to its rightful place in sacred history. Too often Africa has been painted as a passive recipient of Christianity, converted by European missionaries centuries after Christ. Yet the truth revealed by scrolls and traditions is that Africa was at the heart of Christianity from the beginning. Ethiopia became one of the first Christian nations in the world, long before Rome. Egyptian Hebrews and Africans preserved texts and practices that Europe later abandoned. African Hebrews carried the faith across deserts and mountains, embedding it into the fabric of the continent. As more ancient scrolls continue to be studied, from Qumran to Aksum, from Nubia to Cairo, the picture of Christianity's true origins grows clearer. It is not the sanitized European version, but a story of resilience, survival, and cultural blending. It is a story of Hebrew prophets and African scribes, of desert mystics and Ethiopian kings, of scrolls carried across generations to preserve the memory of a faith that began among Hebrews but flowered on African soil. To tell this story is not merely to rewrite history, it is to restore dignity to the people whose contributions were erased. It is to see Jesus and his apostles not as distant Europeanized figures, but as part of the Afro-Asiatic world, deeply connected to Black Hebrew traditions. It is to recognize that the heart of Christianity beats with African rhythms and Hebrew chants, carried forward by scrolls that outlived empires and censorship. The ancient scrolls have spoken, and their testimony is undeniable. The roots of Christianity are Black, Hebrew, and African. To deny this is to deny history itself. To embrace it is to finally understand the true story of the world's most influential faith, a story that begins not in Rome, but in the intertwined destinies of Hebrews and Africans.